Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. Today is another Author's Shelf episode. Today is going to be a weird one because I'm used to talking a lot, and today I can't. Because, well, I'm Craig, your host, and joining me today actually is Drew from Inking Out Loud. Once again, Drew, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I think we owe you a few gold jackets at this point for how often you've come on the show. But we'll get to why you're here in just a moment because there is a purpose behind it. But we should introduce our author guest today. It's James Kennedy. Welcome back, James.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You were. It was one of my favorite conversations in recent memory, and I know the listeners gave a lot of good feedback on the episode that we did in the fall on determinism.
Yes.
It was, really fascinating stuff. So now you're back for an Author's Shelf episode, and you've chosen The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, and my copy of it is sitting over on the table. Dang it. Oh, well. The Man Who Was Thursday. There you go. Now he's holding it up for us. By G.K. Chesterton, by way of David Lynch, as far as I can tell. This is the 1908 novel, and it absolutely defies categorization. And I don't know about defies, but certainly resists even a story breakdown. It's hard to tell people what the story is about other than there's a cop who goes undercover and infiltrates a group of anarchists, and all hell breaks loose.
We can work up to that.
We'll work up to it.
Yeah.
So here's the deal, guys. I do want to tell people listening, we're going to not spoil the end of the story and who the players involved are until a certain moment. So as far as possible, let's, see if we can get through 20 minutes plus of conversation without spoiling it so that people will maybe be intrigued if they've never read it and go read it. And then we'll spoiler alert before we get to the ending and all that stuff. Fair?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. And before we start talking about the book, everybody needs to go to thelegendarium.com and check out all of our past episodes, check out the Discord link to join the conversation, and the Patreon link for, supporting the show. Anyway.
And if you find me so fascinating, then you should check out my YA fantasy novel, The Order of Oddfish, my sci-fi thriller, Dare to Know, or the book that's going to be coming out this fall, Bride of the Tornado.
Bride of the Tornado?
That's a great title.
Thank you.
Excellent.
I was almost talked out of that title. I'm being published by Quirk Books, and they're like, I don't know, James, it seems a little pulpy to me. And I was like, you guys put out Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. You can
do Bride of the Tornado.
Yeah. You can spot me a Bride of the Tornado. You did Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. I think I'm okay.
I haven't even heard of that one yet.
Neither have I.
That's hilarious. That's awesome. So yes, in fact, we talked about Dare to Know the last time around. And maybe we'll bring it up again at the end of this episode. But for now, let's talk Chesterton. James, I invited you on for Author's Shelf, and the deal is I always say, okay, what do you want us to read? And those are basically the only parameters. And we've gotten some weird stuff and some great stuff on the Author's Shelf because of that, because I'm just like, throw the gate open wide. What's important to you? What's been influential to you? You chose G.K. Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday. Why?
Okay, it's an important book to me. This is kind of like a cult novel that certain people know about it, and everybody who knows about it is kind of gaga over it or hates it, which is the kind of book that I like to write. It's an important book to me. It's like fantastical. It's religious. It's argumentative. It's melodramatic, and it's way over the top. I think it's what people used to call like a young man's book. Chesterton wrote it when he was 34. It was published in 1908. And I was in my mid-20s when I first read it. And my relationship to it and Chesterton has changed over the years. Like C.S. Lewis, Chesterton is someone I've always appreciated, but in a wary way. Like when I first encountered both of those authors, I found them bracing, but over time, like some aspects of them became like kind of hectoring and mechanical. But when I think about this book and the way it affected me and the time in my life in which I encountered it, it's kind of my own personal fight club. And it's kind of also awesome. I'm going to argue it's kind of like the Book of Job. And And so can I just like kind of set up for you, like just biographically where I was, or autobiographically when I first read it?
This is why we're here, James. The world needs to know.
And so, Drew, you're Catholic, right?
I am.
Okay. So so let me tell you who I was when I first read it. I was raised Catholic, church every Sunday, give stuff up for Lent, like very Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school, and then I went to University of Notre Dame, even though I was never really that pious. And I'm telling you all this because Chesterton was super Catholic. It really informs his writing, although he wasn't yet a Catholic when he wrote The Man Who Is Thursday. So anyway, I graduated from Notre Dame in 1995. I was a double major in physics and philosophy. And after that, I didn't want to be a scientist anymore. And frankly, I wasn't a Catholic anymore. And I did want to do some good. So I became a volunteer science teacher at a Catholic middle school in Washington, D.C. And I lived in a convent, which is a bunch of nuns, which is the wrong place for a 21-year-old man to be living. And I taught science to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And then I moved to Tokyo. I was an English teacher there for a while. Then I came back to the States. I lived with my parents for like a year and a half while I got another degree in computer science. And then I moved to Chicago in 2000. I became a computer programmer. So I read The Man Who Is Thursday in that in-between time in 1998, 1999. And I want to talk about that time, because it bears a lot of resemblance to the time when Chesterton wrote The Man Who Is Thursday, which he comments on, especially in the first chapter and in the poem that opens the book. Both times had this like fin de siècle mixture of ennui and I don't know, something else in French, like decadence. The late 90s was a weird era, like in American like culture. Like on the one hand, there's like this ambient, like Francis Fukuyama end of history atmosphere. There's this facile, brittle confidence that all the big problems have been solved. Cold War is over. Liberal democracy has won. But it no longer really felt like a big victory. And you couldn't put your finger on what was weird. And there's like a second feature of this. It's kind of like feeling of, is that all there is? And kind of like boredom. And that in the pop culture shorthand for that is like stuff like Seinfeld, like the sitcom about nothing, or Fight Club, which men are so bored that they just want to beat themselves up because they got nothing to do. And then that's the third strand of 1999 was like, we know something terrible is going to happen soon. Some catastrophe is going to happen. And that kind of shook pop culture, like, in terms of pop culture, it was like, oh, Y2K or whatever. But really, like, what it was, like, the cracks started happening is like anodyne vision, like when the chaos of the election in 2000, and then, September 11th happened and American character changed permanently, catastrophically. And so I'm going into this because Chesterton published The Man Who Is Thursday, like in 1908, which is a similarly culturally exhausted time. The old ideas felt worn out. Everyone kind of sensed, maybe half wanted a catastrophe to come and turn the page. Virginia Woolf famously said, on or about December 1910, human character changed. And then in 1914, World War I started. And everyone got what they wanted, a catastrophe that put the old order to bed. And The Man Who Is Thursday, like Fight Club, is like a document that relies on this idea of exhaustion with the old order for its power. Although the two stories don't have much other in common, except for two things: a delight in cartoonish violence, and they're total dude books. Like there are no women characters of any note in either of the books, except in the kind of like a peripheral to the action kind of way.
Yeah.
But also intersects with what's going on with literature at the time in another way. Everyone was really concerned about anarchists and bomb outrages at the time, just as like people were concerned about like Islamofascism, at the post 9/11 time. And, it was an anarchist who took out Franz Ferdinand in 1914 and started World War I. And the year before this book came out, there was a book by Joseph Conrad called The Secret Agent, which is about the same thing, they're both about anarchist conspiracies, turn of the century London, both have a double agent as the main character. Both of them, like there's fake anarchists. But this one is almost like a parody or a transfiguration of The Secret Agent. Anyway, I just want to do this wind up just to get you where I was feeling at times. This book came to my hands during this time. I felt frustrated stalemate living with my parents after I'd lived on my own in DC and Tokyo. I devoured everything I could of Chesterton after I read it. And there's diminishing returns in reading all of Chesterton, but like this book always remains fresh. It influenced the direction of my writing. Like this, Miyazaki's Spirited Away and the Mike Leigh movie Topsy Turvy all came around the same time and were really influential to my artistic development. So that is I want to put it in that broad context to start out.
That's a lot of that. Yeah, that's a lot of context. And
sorry. Was that too much?
No,
not at all.
Really good.
Not at all. It's just now you've got me casting my mind back to the end of the 90s. And
wasn't it a weird time?
It was a very weird time. I was, Drew, I'm a little older than you, I guess, but we were both teenagers at the time.
I was born in 1990, so I remember the late 90s, but I had a very different perspective. I was a child.
Yeah. I was 25. So
that's hilarious.
So what's it about? Should we talk about what it's about?
Yes, absolutely. Drew, do you want to? I feel like I want you to tell us what the first 80 pages of the book is about.
Yeah,
because the last 20 pages are about something very different.
First 80 pages is no spoiler. Yeah.
So it is a story of an English undercover police officer who is recruited to infiltrate a global cabal of diabolic anarchists. And he manipulates his way in through poetry at first, and then he kind of challenges the masculinity of his adversary, and through bravado ends up being nominated to being on the ruling council of the anarchists.
Yeah, which each member... Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and they're all named after days of the week, and he is given the title of Thursday. And as he gets deeper and deeper in, he has encounters with each of the other weekdays and Saturday, and slowly discovers, I am not the only one who's an undercover cop. In fact, we're all undercover cops.
Okay, that's the twist, right?
It's one of them. It's one of them.
I don't think of that as the twist. I think of Sunday as the twist.
Okay,
right.
Sunday being the leader of this,
and I think this is a really interesting conversation point, because I come at this book as a still practicing Catholic in my 30s. Mm-hmm. I never even thought about this book in that sort of cultural weariness context. I thought of this book as a religious revelation context.
Yeah.
And so to me, kind of the granular plot details of the story almost don't matter, because it's that culminating point that I won't talk about yet in the final act that the book just becomes something entirely different.
This is so interesting. So James is coming at this book from a kind of social or cultural perspective. Drew, for you, it's a religious book. And for me, it's an ideological one, with all of the discussions, especially toward the beginning of the book.
I think I'm not totally cultural social. Like I think the full title is The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. And that's the way to approach it, because it's dreamlike. It's sometimes nonsensical. Like it's like summer 1 minute, and then one day later it's snowing. The times don't work out. Like it's nonsensical, but it's full of dread. But it also has a lot of joy, and this novel gets away with it. It would be foolish to try to emulate this novel. It has a real lightning in a bottle quality that Chesterton never quite touched again. Chesterton does say he met a psychoanalyst that said that he prescribed the book as a corrective to his morbid patients. And because you meet all of these grotesque people who are the other, I guess we've let the cat out of the bag. All the other weekdays and Saturday are other policemen. But they keep getting surprised when the next one turns out to be a policeman too. And the next one. And all these people who seem to be grotesque or weird or freaks all turn out to be normal, decent guys doing their best. And so it has this feeling of dipping in from the ordinary world into a nightmare, and then emerging from it like transformed, like healthier and happier. And I remember reading somewhere else that another therapist, like later on, recommended Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the same reason, because it helped those patients. In the same way, the story starts, ordinary world, the worst thing in the world happens, the world blows up. But by the end of the book, like, you're reconciled to that awful thing, and actually you're kind of having a splendid time. And that's another lightning in a bottle book by a British man who could never quite recapture that early magic again either. And so, but like that whole twist of like one after another, they keep thinking, oh, okay, the 2 of us are secretly policemen. Well, the rest of them are definitely evil. Okay, the 3 of us are? Okay, now the rest of them are the really bad ones. 4 of us? And it's kind of Lucy in the football again and again. And like when I read it, like I was just on board for it. I was convinced. Oh yeah, okay, only 3 of them are policemen. Okay, only 4 of them are policemen. Like I'm a very gullible person. Yeah. I mean, I don't know when we should reveal the big joke in the book, but but I think for me, it's very much a metaphysical book. That's why I like it. It's an argumentative book. It talks about what is the nature of the world. So I wanted to set up the social and cultural thing, but I do want to talk about this. The reason this is so exciting is it's a book about the nature of the world.
Yes.
And what does it say? I don't know. Is this too big a question? What does it say about the nature of the world? Because one of the things that Chesterton seems to do really well in this book is he seems very comfortable with contradiction.
That's his
characters and their ideas, and it's something that I feel like in our day today, contradiction is unacceptable. We have kind of a weird ideological purity contest going on all over the world, where nobody seems to be willing to accept contradiction. Whereas in this book, it's like it's shot all through. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's unavoidable, and I think one of the things I really love about the progression of it is the unreality of it. The world feels blurred.
Yeah.
Like the setting feels blurred. It's so fast. You never have a chance to get your bearings in the story, in the settings. You just, boom, we're going here, we're going here, we're going here, we're going here. And then we have this one particular moment that has always just stood out in my mind when they're fleeing through the countryside and they're running through the forest.
Yes.
And there's this contrast of the light and the shadows.
Yes.
And it's like, I feel in that moment, Chesterton is making one of his main points in the book that there is no singularity. There's no lack of contradiction anywhere. The people chasing them are at turns obscured and then cast in sharp relief. He uses the word chiaroscuro. And Chesterton was also an artist, so like he knows.
Oh, you can tell. This is all very painterly, very visual.
You'll have to explain what that means, Drew.
It's like it's when things are like thrown in really sharp relief,
light
like
and shadow. Yeah,
strong contrast of light and shadow. And so, in that moment, right, it's one of the most tense moments in the whole book, in my opinion. It feels hopeless. They're being ringed in. And then as the scene progresses, we find out, of course, again, there's a contradiction there.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's so overheated. I just heard a weird voice. Like
that's probably me. Let's be honest. My voice is just odd. It's just weird. That scene in the forest, because I want to talk about how argumentative he is and how there's great dialogue in it. People are always having philosophical arguments in a really bracing and fun way. But you're right. It's a legit adventure story. I think we have to sell people on this. There's a chase. There's disguises. There's secret codes. There's a duel. There's funny banter. There's dark councils. There's like a spooky physical impossibilities. What seems like a feeble, frail old man is like somehow chasing our hero all over London, or they're in a duel. The hero's sword keeps going into one guy again and again, but the guy isn't bleeding. It's like, what's going on? Kingsley Amis wrote that it's not quite a political bad dream, not a metaphysical thriller, not a cosmic joke in the form of a spy novel, but it has something of all three. And I think that gets it. It really stands between a lot of things, and and it's really funny too. I think we have to say that too. But but this overheated aspect of it, he does things that people can't get away with. And I think that scene that you talked about in the forest is one of them. Imagine trying to get away with writing this now.
Such were the 6 men who had sworn to destroy the world. And then it skip over a little bit and go, each figure seemed to be somehow in the borderland of things, just as their theory was in the borderland of thought. He knew that each one of these men stood at an extreme end, so to speak, of some wild road of reasoning. He could only fancy, as in some old world fable, that if a man went westward to the end of the world, he would find something, say a tree, that was more or less than a tree possessed by a spirit. And if he went east to the end of the world, he would find something else that was not wholly itself, a tower perhaps, but the very shape was wicked. So these figures seem to stand up violent and unaccountable against an ultimate horizon, visions from the verge. It's like, that is so over the top. It's like Lovecraft is over the top, you know?
Well, this is why I made my David Lynch joke at the beginning. Yeah. Like, this is, it's so absurd.
And so there's a place for restraint and tastefulness and subtlety in literature, but there's also a liberation in casting all that off and putting the pedal to the metal and going whole hog. And the thing about going whole hog is it's more courageous than exhibiting taste or restraint, because if you're restrained and tasteful and you're trying to kind of hide what you really think, the worst you can be is boring. But if you go whole hog, you turn it up to 11 every scene, you say what you really think, even though you know it's a little bit ludicrous, and you're not able to carry it off, you are loud and ridiculous, and it's much worse. It's a bigger risk. Since so few authors do that, it's really refreshing when somebody does it and they get away with it.
Like the premise of what the antagonists want, like they're not just anarchists.
Yes,
they're beyond anarchists. Like they don't just want to abolish like
government or
civilization,
something.
Government.
Yeah,
they say we want to abolish God. We do not only want to upset a few despotisms and police regulations. That sort of anarchism does exist, but it is a mere branch of the nonconformists. We dig deeper and we blow you higher. We wish to deny all these arbitrary distinctions of vice and virtue, honor and treachery upon which mere rebels base themselves. The silly sentimentalists of the French Revolution talked of the rights of man. We hate rights as we hate wrongs. We have abolished right and wrong. So I have right here, Wisdom and Innocence by Joseph Pierce, kind of a biography of Chesterton, and Pierce notes, he's like, this isn't amorality or immorality, it's anti-morality. That last line, we hate rights as we hate wrongs, we have abolished right and wrong. It's like that they want to go beyond the idea of good and evil and discover something worse.
And I think that's why the comedy works so well, because you need a little bit of comedy to take the air out of this, because it's so over the top. I think of like the nihilists in The Big Lebowski. We are nihilists, Mr. Lebowski. And Chesterton, when he wrote this, like, he was having a nervous breakdown when he was in art school, and he of this kind of pessimism of like, what is the world like, that's why this has a nightmarish feeling. But he's kind of like writing himself out of depression. He's writing himself out of a nightmare. He's writing himself out of believing these things, and that's why it has so much power. And that's why, like, when he finally kind of settled into orthodoxy and like became a total Catholic, and then at that point he was just like churning out Father Brown mysteries. He was so certain of himself that his polemics just became mechanical, but here he's really struggling. He's really on the knife edge of one worldview and another worldview. And that's why this book works so well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's that's what gives the beginning of the novel its urgency, I guess.
Yeah.
Is the conversations between our main character and his kind of opponent in the
Gregory,
anarchist. Yeah, Gregory, that's right.
The fake anarchist, who turns out to be the real
Gregory
anarchist.
Lucian?
Yeah.
Lucian Gregory.
Yeah.
Other way around. Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I loved the first part of the novel because I felt like I had some grasp on what you're talking about, James. Like his kind of teetering, which way is he going to go? Is one way or the other? Or one of you said that. Anyway.
Yeah.
And then by the end of the book, it becomes. I hesitate to say religious because it seems like it goes further than that. It's more like what is human nature and what is what is society and togetherness and how do we relate to the people around us. Should we talk about the ending? Sorry, Drew, do you have something before we spoil it?
I do. So both of you so far have brought up the word nature. And I think that's really fascinating because in an interview, and this ties back to the idea of contradictions in this, Chesterton himself was never really capable of elucidating what he was getting at in this book.
That's why it's so good.
He contradicted himself in interviews.
Yeah.
And at one point in an interview, he was asked to explain the nature of Sunday, this enigmatic character. And he said, you can take him to stand for nature, capital N, nature, as distinguished from God. Yet in the very same interview, he stated that, quote, you tear off the mask of nature and you find God.
Yeah, I mean, Chesterton loves paradox. He loves epigrams. He has this kind of sub-Wildian wit about him that is like almost is 90% wild, but he turns it towards a different kind of target than Wilde would. And and it's stuff like that makes him so interesting to read at first until it starts to become a shtick. But whenever I come back to Chesterton after a year or so, and I'm not worried about him, it's very like, I love that kind of stuff. When he says, oh, you tear off the mask of nature and it's God. And then like, after he's talked like that and you've gone through a couple of books where it's like, oh boy, it becomes wearying, but I do love him in ways that I love few other authors because of how idiosyncratic he is, and how he says things that like other authors don't say. He's got a definite argument to make all the time. You were talking, Craig, at the beginning about the argument that they're having in the garden. Can I just read like my favorite part of that argument?
Yeah.
So they're talking about like Gregory, who's a guy who's like saying, I'm an anarchist, and he's trying to convince everybody there, like, I'm really an anarchist. I'm so badass. He's what we nowadays call an edgelord, right?
Yes,
and he goes,
absolutely.
An artist is identical with an anarchist, he cried. You may transpose the words anywhere. An anarchist is an artist. The man who throws a bomb is an artist because he prefers a great moment to everything. Blah, blah, blah. A poet dislikes in disorder only. If it were not so, the most poetical thing in the world would be the Underground Railway. And then our hero, Mr. Syme, says, so it is. And Gregory says, what are you talking about? I'm just skipping ahead. When you're on the train, people are upset. They're bored with life because they know the train is always going to arrive at Victoria Station. He's like, wouldn't they be so happy if instead of the train arriving at Victoria Station, it showed up at Baker Street? And then Syme says, it is you who are unpoetical. If what you say of clerks is true, they can only be prosaic, boring, as your poetry. The rare, strange thing is to hit the mark. The gross, obvious thing is to miss it. We think it is epical when a man with one wild arrow strikes a distant bird. Is it not also epical when man with one wild engine strikes a distant station? Chaos is dull, because in chaos a train might indeed go anywhere from Baker Street to Baghdad. But man is a magician, and his whole magic is this, is that he does say Victoria, and lo, it is Victoria. And he says, like, oh, take away your poetry. Give me, like, the railway, schedules. That's poetic. Every time a train comes in, I feel it is broken through batteries of besiegers, and man has won a battle against chaos. Nobody talks like this. It's great. And like, in literature, you don't have, these kind of, like, he does it with such energy and confidence that even if you don't totally agree with him, you are swept along and you love it.
And
it's very similar
favorite
to
little literary jokes that Chesterton makes in this entire book is actually the very first line of that quote, or of Syme's reply. He says, "It is you who are unpoetical," replied the poet Syme.
Yeah.
The fact that he doesn't say replied Syme.
Yeah.
The poet Syme. That is perfect.
He does. The beginning of this book, reading it, reminded me of another Author's Shelf episode that we did with Mary Robinette Kowal, and she chose The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. For anybody who's read The Dispossessed, my critique of that one is that it wasn't as condensed and fiery as this one, where she really is quite long-winded in her character's interactions. And in this, it's kind of like you're saying, James, it's all turned up to 11. Everybody's got their hair on fire in every scene, and nobody goes halfway with the points that they're making. And I found, so I guess I'm partly comparing the two because they're both message books, even if Chesterton didn't quite know what his message was. Yeah. It feels very much like a message book. But he's a little more sharp and concise than Le Guin was. And so I think it's because I preferred reading this one.
Yeah, I think it's because he's a journalist. Journalists are almost always really good fiction writers. Tom Wolfe is a journalist, and so he's a good fiction writer. They have the nose for a detail. They've had to transcribe in interviews a lot of dialogue, so they know how people talk, and they know how to edit it down to make it punchy. Journalists often make really good screenwriters and novelists.
No, they know how to not bury the lead.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of burying the lead, well, no, that doesn't quite work. But let's talk about the end of the book. Okay, I'm officially lifting our ban on spoilers.
Okay.
So if anybody hasn't read it, please go do so. I don't know. I kind of feel like I need to give one last recommendation for somebody who hasn't read the book. It's crazy. It's bizarre. It's Lynchian. It's you will not have any idea what happened. This is a book that needs rereads, but that's okay because it's only 100 pages long. It's anyway. Okay, go read the book.
It's also something that you can't believe it was written over 100 years ago. It seems so fresh, and I keep saying bracing, tonic, energetic. Those are the words for it, and vivid. And the dialogue is so sharp and pungent. And like back and forth. It just it really it doesn't feel like it was written 120 years ago.
Fully agree. All right, so the final act of the book shifts gears. It tonally shifts gears. Hard. The final act of the book, they're in France. They're trying to outrun this conspiracy of people that are coming to get them. So these are all the weekday people, who think, so oh my gosh, the whole world is in on it, and they're getting chased around, and they find out that the secretary of the
Monday,
Monday, he's after them, and it turns out he's part of he's a Scotland Yard detective as well, and it's the final kind of joke in that way, But then we have our moment with Sunday, who's this kind of it's a chase scene, but it's the weirdest chase scene I've ever seen in my entire life.
Well, go on. But before that chase scene, like Sunday, they all go to confront Sunday, right? It's like, okay, it's like 6 of us against him, but it's Sunday, what are we going to do? So he's like, Sunday is always presented as this larger than life character. They go and they confront him, and each one of these men got hired to be on this secret police by a man in a dark room with his back to them. And at the end, Sunday says, "I'm the guy who hired you all." and then he jumps off the balcony, and they start this chase through London, right? And he breaks into the zoo and gets on an elephant, and they're chasing him on this elephant. And then Sunday keeps throwing back at them pieces of paper that seemingly is caught by each day of the week, but when they read it, it seems to be something that's like insulting to them, but completely incomprehensible. And then like Sunday gets in a balloon, right? And they chase him over the countryside, and he lures them into this supernatural pageant or party, right? Or gala, which is that each of the days of the week they put on a costume. But the costume reveals who they are. It doesn't, obscure who they are. And they kind of go through this very Lynchian dreamlike scene in which they are truly become themselves. And then it's kind of like, it seems like it was all just an ecstatic vision that had happened in a moment. And our main character is just walking down the street with the edgelord anarchist from the end. Is that kind of like what you say the end of the book is like?
Yeah, well, it's that's one of the weirdest things. It doesn't have to be taken this way, but it certainly reads like it was all a dream. The whole book was a dream, which normally would be infuriating if the dream didn't actually mean something, right? Or the nightmare.
I mean, Lynch does it. Yeah, Lynch can get away with it. He did it in Mulholland Drive and arguably in Lost Highway. Like he does have that. Like it was all a dream, and somehow he gets away. That Wizard of Oz and this get away with
it. Don't try this at home, kids. Right?
Exactly.
But there's something I want to talk about as far as the 3 levels theory that we talk about a lot on this podcast, and so I'll give everybody the quick rundown again. This is something we've talked about on the Legendarium for a long time, that stories can and often do exist on one of three levels. And this is the wrong way, because I don't actually think of it hierarchically. But level one being the story itself, the events, the actual surface level, what's going on in the story. Level two would be social and political commentary, kind of 30,000-foot view of, socio-political stuff. And then level three would be the personal and interpersonal. What does it mean to be a good person? How do you think of yourself? How do you interact with those closest to you? That sort of thing, right? By the time you get to the end of the book, he has hit all three, as you say, James, with the dial turned up to 11. He doesn't just... A lot of stories will exist primarily on one level, right? So you go watch Pacific Rim. That's my favorite example of a level one story. And it'll have a few scenes in there where, the characters are bonding, or they're trying to learn some lesson. But really, it's just a little bit of oil to make the machine go so you can get to the next scene with monsters punching robots.
I think it's the first time anybody's ever used the words Pacific Rim and favorite in the same sentence, but go on.
Don't get me started. I love that movie.
Okay.
Anyway, no, but so that one, it lives on that level one plane, and then it'll kind of dip into the other ones, but really it's not meant to do that. In here, when he is existing on any of those three levels, he goes hard. And one of the things I really liked was, by the end of the book, you find out that they're being chased across the countryside by these, kind of faceless mobs. And it turns out, they're saying, oh my gosh, they can't all be anarchists. They've unmasked us. They're trying to kill us, this global conspiracy. And then it turns out that everybody in the world was actually thought that they were the anarchists. These, the protagonists. Oh, they think we're anarchists, and that's why they're trying to kill us.
It's a comedy. It's ludicrous.
It is. But I think there's something there. It is funny. I did laugh out loud when I got to that portion. But there's something in that kind of level 3 or level 2 where I feel like Chesterton is, in a way, making the point that whoever you're interacting with, whatever their station is, they're not your enemy. You're probably misunderstanding each other. Maybe a little more communication, a little more charity, whatever, something. But everybody seems to be misunderstanding each other all the time because they just assume that they know the motivations of those around them. Something along those lines.
Oh, I think you're completely spot on, because the way the book ends is with these two adversaries from the beginning, Gabriel Simon, Lucy, and Gregory, becoming friends and having a friendly conversation and walking down the road together in the morning. And the entire book is this progression of understanding and not only like shining light on facts and knowledge, whatever, but understanding that you will not always have that light shone on the people you find yourself pitted against or interacting with. That there's always going to be something obscured, and you should not take that obscuring as a sign of like enmity.
Yeah, and also this book is all about enemies turning into friends. The main character, he thinks all these people on the council are against me. But they're also unmasked in the most kind of ridiculous ways. Like, one of them is just like, oh, the fact that he's wearing dark glasses makes him evil. And as soon as he takes them off, it's like, oh, now I know this guy is good. It's has the simplicity of a child's story in the same way that Star Wars does. It's like, maybe this is like the man who associated as Star Wars, and I haven't read The Dispossessed, but maybe that's more like Andor, more like serious and long and subtle, but doesn't have the same punch, and both of them have their own pleasures. But or just like, they're all unmasked in like just kind of goofiest ways, and people just say, "Oh, I just know he's good somehow because of his accent, because of the way he says this or that." And so, yeah, I really enjoyed that kind of like feeling of. That's right, it's a comedy. Comedies have happy endings, right? And it kind of like all kind of comes together in a reconciliation,
which is awesome in a book called subtitled "A Nightmare." Right.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare, a comedy.
But you're right. It does turn into an insane cartoon at the end, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh!
With that,
the elephant and the hot air balloon it's just bananas. It's so I was okay. Let me back up a little bit and give a little context. We're reading Joe Abercrombie right now. I'm going through the First Law trilogy, and I'm in the second book, and I'm struggling to care, honestly. Sorry, Joe. I'm struggling to care, but Ryan, my co-host, he keeps saying, like, I'm thoroughly enjoying my reread because I have the full picture in front of me. I know how it's going to end. I know what the twists and turns are, and now I get to see what Abercrombie is doing with the trilogy. And that in that case, it's frustrating me. But in this case, I feel like it's okay that this book has to be reread, and probably has to be reread 10 times before its secrets are finally, begin to reveal themselves, right? But it annoys me less here, maybe just because it is so fun. Because, a teenage boy could pick it up and just read a detective story on top of everything else, right? So
yeah, I do a podcast with my friend Matt, and he says his like, drama is how it is, and genre is how it feels, and I think that's true here. Like Star Wars is how it feels, but like Andor is how it is, kind of thing. You know what I mean? I don't like this is how it feels to be young. In many ways, it's like a young man's book. It's like everything is turned up to 11, and when Gabriel's like walking down the streets of London at night, and it's written in this beautiful but over the top and kind of shamelessly over the top way. But that's how it feels to walk around in a city when you're 23, And so, when Chesterton does things like have an elephant chase or a balloon chase, he's signaling to you, I'm going to go outside of reality, here. And so that's the only way that you can build up to that pageant, that dreamlike pageant, by kind of progressively breaking reality more and more, so we get to the part where you'll accept this. It's a promise. It's an expectation setting. And I don't think we could have gotten away with an elephant chase at the beginning of the book. We had to have all of these other things first, of just kind of like, it starts out as just a normal garden party with two guys having a philosophical argument. You couldn't be more normal. And it just gets more, they just break reality more and more, and just becomes more and more joyous and energetic, but also nightmarish. And yeah, I think it's because that's how it feels. That's the thrill in your mind, even if that's not what's physically happening around you.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the culmination of this book is the most unreal, and that is, in my opinion, kind of the final twist, right? That it's not just that Sunday was both the man in the dark room and the
anarchist
leader of the anarchists, but not just in a symbolic sense, but in what appears to be a literal sense. Sunday is Christ. They ask, "Who are you?" He says,
didn't say that.
The Sabbath.
Yeah, he does say that.
He ends, when Gregory shows up, and he has this incredible rant, and he ends with, "Have you ever suffered?" And we have this final quote: "As he gazed, the great face grew to an awful size, grew larger than the colossal mask of Memnon, which had made him scream as a child. It grew larger and larger, filling the whole sky, then everything went black. Only in the blackness before it entirely destroyed his brain, he seemed to hear a distant voice sing a commonplace text that he had heard somewhere. Can ye drink of the cup that I drink of?" A quote from Christ.
Yeah, I think this is the Job. This is what reminds me of Job here. I think it's like, Job says, "You made me suffer all this," and God says, "Hey, can you create a big sea beast the way I did?" Like you can't. Oh, okay. Well, then shut up. And that's what this.
Your impression, by the way, is uncanny. Just.
I think I was quoting from the King James there, it's very much like you get brought to this level of kind of like all the days of the week are saying, like, why did you do this to us? Why are you putting us through this? And then basically Sunday says, I'm God. This is the book of Job, there's a great. He kind of says that earlier. He's like, what am I? Roared the president. That's Sunday. And rose slowly to an incredible height, like some enormous wave about to arch above them and break. You want to know who I am, do you? Bull, you are a man of science. Grub in the roots of those trees and find out the truth about them. Sime, you're a poet. Stare at the morning clouds. But I tell you that you will have found out the truth of the last tree in the topmost cloud before the truth about me. You will understand the sea, and I shall still be a riddle. You shall know what the stars are and not know what I am. Since the beginning of the world, all men have hunted me like a wolf, kings and sages and poets and lawgivers, all the churches and all the philosophies, but I have never been caught yet, and the skies will fall in the time I turn to bay. I have given them a good run for their money, and I will now. That does not seem Christ-like to me. That sounds like Pan. That sounds like the universe itself saying, I will always be one step ahead of you. This doesn't have like the kind of loving kindness that I associate with Christ. Maybe this is like Jehovah. This is like Old Testament God.
I was just going to say, yeah, you're reading the wrong half of the Bible for this one.
I think this ties into that central theme of contradiction, right? We have the when the secretary finally stands up and he gets his moment to rail against Sunday, and he says, I know you are contentment, optimism. What do they call the thing? An ultimate reconciliation. Well, I am not reconciled. If you were the man in the dark room, why were you also Sunday, an offense to the sunlight? If you were from the first our father and our friend, why were you also our greatest enemy? We wept, we fled in terror. The iron entered into our souls, and you are the peace of God. Oh, I can forgive God his anger, though it destroyed nations, but I cannot forgive him his peace.
Chesterton never touched that note again, and that is Chesterton's problem. Chesterton wrote his greatest book in 1908, and then he became reconciled with his faith, reconciled with his problems, and he was never able to really hit the mystery of the book of Job again, because he got too comfortable. He became the villain of this book, the thing that guy's railing against.
I guess so. As you guys are talking about who is Sunday, and there's that quote, you'll never understand me. You can, men and kings have hunted forever. When I got to that section,
over the top.
I know, it's amazing. I didn't read it as God. At first, I thought that's what he was building up to, but then as it continues, I wondered. You mentioned maybe it's the universe. The word I came up with was truth. It is the truth, and people have been searching for the truth forever, and they've never caught up to it, and yet it governs all of our lives, even if we don't understand it. Yeah.
I think if you were to ask G.K. Chesterton, he would say that God and truth are one and the same.
Well, sure. I mean,
that's that systematizing. That's that systematizing Chesterton from later on, not the searching genius from when he was a kid. There's a philosopher, John Gray, who wrote about this book and about Chesterton in general. Chesterton, I want to get into this later on because he's a problematic character. He's anti-Semitic. He's a polemical guy. He is one of those people who's like a weird right-wing person. His brother, Cecil Chesterton, was kind of like the Ben Shapiro of his time, and or the Rush Limbaugh of his time, and Hilaire Belloc. And he was taking all the wrong positions and really being awful to Jewish people, and as many Catholics, were at the time. And we think of Chesterton, he's this jolly, kind of drunken, flinger of epigrams, but there's a bit of a darkness to him too. And I guess The Man Who Was Thursday is kind of like before he kind of ossified into that. And I think the novel, so John Gray wrote about this, and he's like, The Man Who Was Thursday was subtitled Nightmare, a coda which indicates the author's unease. The novel gives the lie to his Christian faith in a meaningful universe. And he kind of goes on for a bit, and then he says, Some have tried to interpret The Man Who Is Thirsty as a type of Christian allegory. The world it describes, however, has more in common with the interminable labyrinth of Kafka's castle. In the orderly Christian cosmos, which Chesterton wanted to believe, nothing is finally tragic, still less absurd. The world is a divine comedy. The ultimate significance is never in doubt. In The Man Who Is Thursday, the world is illegible. It may be nonsensical. This was a nightmare he struggled, for the most part, successfully to forget. Producing a succession of wearisome polemics and mechanical paradoxes, he spent the rest of his life denying the vision that informed his greatest work. That is my take on it, too.
Ultimately, for me, one of the triumphs of this book, again, having only read it once and not knowing what the hell is going on in this story, but doing the best I can, one of the triumphs of this book is that because of the contradictions we're talking about and because of we often talk about the 30,000 foot view. How about the universal view, right? Where he's blowing it out to what is God, what is truth, what is, all of those things. Because he never quite comes down on one side or the other with a lot of these questions, and because it's so open to interpretation, we have 3 people here on this podcast who all draw wildly different interpretations and meanings from the same text. You've quoted a few of the critics who have written about it as well. They all have different interpretations of it. And isn't that, in that way, doesn't this book do a great job of portraying the chaos that is life, that is thought, that is ideas, that is the universe, and all of our interactions with each other, because you can't come to necessarily the one true interpretation of The Man Who Was Thursday, right?
That's why it's literature, right? I mean, because because it's a undecidable question, because you can't come down anywhere. That's why it's not just a genre piece. I think that's why I will read it and reread this until I die, the same way I'll watch Lynch movies until I die, because there's an undecidability about them. And it feels like there's an endless mystery to them. And I think it comes out of the fact that for him it was a mystery too. Like he himself was unsettled. Right.
And that's, I think there is some value to unsettling, or to settling yourself. James, it sounds like the way Chesterton came down, you don't approve of a lot of the certainties that he came to. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, we all have to come to our own, don't we?
Maybe that's the tragedy.
We can't all live our lives in a Lynchian nightmare, from birth to death. At some point we do have to decide how we're going to live our lives, how we're going to think about things. Anyway.
I think that is why this book is so great, because it grapples with these issues. It's a short book. It reads like a boy's own adventure novel, and it's over the top and overheated, and yet it grapples with these big issues in a big way. But even though it seems like an adventurous story, and I think that's something pretty amazing. I think. Yeah. I think
the fact that 115 years later we're sitting down having this conversation. Yeah. That's a rare thing.
Well, I think there's this. Here, I read a couple books after I reread this to get ready for this, and I realized that one of the things that made it so good is that it seems like for a lot of novels, there's just kind of like this view from nowhere about them. They don't seem to be standing for anything other than maybe the power of storytelling. They're not making sharp claims about the universe and defending them with vigor, or they're not saying counterintuitive things. Unless you're like going like William Burroughs or something like that, you know what I mean? But like just like your standard piece of literary fiction is just kind of like is just basically about, okay, we're all kind of believe more or less in the consensus reality of late capitalism, liberal democracy, Freudian psychology, whatever. And the fact that this takes a left turn from all that is what makes it so fun. It has very particular philosophical commitments, things it wants to convince you about. And I think C.S. Lewis is like this too. And it's like why they're so fun to read and why they're so wearisome in the end. But these, these commitments are just far away enough from the consensus that it's interesting, not so far away to be incomprehensible. And the thing, I guess the reason I'm coming down a little bit hard on him is like from 1998 to 2000, I read all Chesterton's work I could. And he started to feel more paradoxy. Those paradoxes started to feel mechanical. He was very pugilistic. It was kind of like Christian apologetics through the back door, but they ossified into something mechanical. But I just like that you have characters that make explicit philosophical arguments and they really mix it up. And even though you know where the author falls on it, he really, in a good faith way, lets the other side get their digs in too. It doesn't feel like Ayn Rand or something in which like all the people she disagrees with are dumbasses.
I was going to say, how do you feel about The Ball and the Cross?
It's good, but I don't reread it like I reread this one. The one I reread, the second to this one, is A Club of Queer Trades. Which I really like. The Ball and the Cross is it doesn't seem to have the oomph of this. It definitely has a lot of great images. It has that beginning image of like the Zeppelin coming through the fog to the top of the cathedral. I read like Chesterton's Orthodoxy and Everlasting Man, and I read like C.S. Lewis's Christian Apologetics, not because I totally agree with him, but I just feel that we can intelligently disagree about it, and you get to see the pleasure of a mind at work on these problems who's not a polemicist, but is having a good faith discussion. That is what's fun about them. You don't feel like, oh God, I'm just gonna have somebody yell at me, or tell me that I'm dumb or I'm wicked. Like it's like, oh well, and since I grew up in this kind of atmosphere, it's a familiar place for me.
So my next question for you is: have you read much Gene Wolfe?
Oh, I know I should because he's Illinois. He's Catholic. I'm Chicago. Neil Gaiman loves him. I know. He's somebody who's always on my list. I know that he just died, right?
2018, yeah.
Yeah, and so I write it down on a piece of paper and I lose a piece of paper. No, I haven't read him.
Yeah, because he is in many ways a spiritual successor of Chesterton, but of this kind of Chesterton. He leans into the weird. Mm-hmm. He has no problem making his characters complicated and paradoxical. He is, I'm sure you've heard this before, the master of the unreliable narrator. Was, rest his soul. But, and like you said, it's the idea of a mind at work on difficult problems who is having a good faith argument. I think it says a lot that he was, a Catholic man, a deeply religious man, and yet was great friends with Ursula Le Guin. They could not have been, on more different sides of the political spectrum there. Yeah. But they had a great deal of respect for each other. And, and so I love seeing that generation of writers, especially the talents that came out, because even when they disagreed on things, they were able to work on these problems and speak about them in intelligent and respectful ways, and then take those conversations and come up with something absolutely bonkers for a book.
Yeah, and Chesterton was like that too. He was big friends with H.G. Wells, and they couldn't have disagreed more. There is, I guess, talking about disagreements. Can we talk about like how he? I want to talk about how he reads now as opposed to how I first read him in 1999. Because reading him now feels different than reading him in 1999 in that cultural and political context. Like,
well, and your personal context.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah. Because it's reactionary in a way that didn't read like that to me in 1999. Because like in 1990 there was this kind of anodyne cultural liberalism and kind of peacefulness about the ideological world. It was a very, very much felt like a post-political time. We're in a very political time now. And some things that he says now are like rub up so close against like what they call tradcath stuff online that it kind of like, oh, I don't know if I like, like Chesterton was against women's suffrage. I mean, this is not a guy that I'm going to agree with everything about. On one page, he says like, the scientific and artistic worlds are silently bound in a crusade against the family and the state. Like, in 1999, that sounded like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But now it seems like a typical right-wing paranoia about wokeism or whatever, you know? But then it can seem left-wing, Chesterton, by our modern lights. Like a policeman criticizes how policing works. He says, our ordinary treatment of the poor criminal was a pretty brutal business. I tell you, I'm sometimes sick of my trade when I see how perpetually it means merely a war upon the ignorant and desperate. It's like, oh, okay. Well, wait, are you left or are you right? But then he turns around.
Almost like those things are made up.
Yeah, exactly. But it's these categories are so ossified now. It's much harder to think beyond them now than it was, I think, about 24 years ago when I first read this. That because then he pivots. That same detective talks about how, what we're looking for now is intellectual crime. This is how he says, like, the ordinary detective goes to pothouses to arrest thieves. We go to artistic tea parties to detect pessimists. The ordinary detective discovers from a ledger or a diary a crime has been committed. We discover from a book of sonnets that a crime will be committed. It was like, what? So it's a fanciful notion here. But of course, this is nightmarish if it was ever real. Basically, it's O'Brien from 1984. It's thought crime, right? But Chesterton is talking about it is that it's a good thing. But now in this era of like total surveillance of online discourse, which anything you write or say can be turned against you, like this kind of like thing is like, oh yeah, let's go against the intellectuals, you know, that does not seem that great anymore. And so, but then he turns around and says like, you've got this eternal idiotic idea. If anarchy came, it would come from the poor. Why should it? The poor have been rebels, but they have never been anarchists. They have more interest in anyone else of being decent government. The poor man really has a stake in the country. The rich man hasn't. He can go away to New Guinea in a yacht. The poor have sometimes objected to be governed badly. The rich have always objected to being governed at all. This is like a critique of like libertarians, you know, and like seasteaders and stuff like that. So he goes left to right, in terms of like our modern categories. And that's what makes him so fun to read. He's reactionary, but unpredictable. He wasn't a capitalist and he wasn't a communist. He was this thing called a distributist, which means that like, well, wealth should be shared among everybody. Everybody should have like a little bit of land, a pig at the end of the garden, grow their own vegetables.
Chicken in every pot, and a car in every garage.
Exactly. But like nobody wanted that. And it never came to be. But I guess like there's this vestigial atavistic part of me that kind of takes delight in his reactionary positions because I was raised Catholic, but enjoying Chesterton inoculated me against harsher strains of reactionary thought that came along later that we're seeing right now. Like, I feel like, I got it out of my system by reading Chesterton. Because I know that if I was in high school in 2016, I would have been like some weird alt-right kid who would have made myself obnoxious. Because I was very transgressive when I was a kid, and I would have, back in the 90s, 80s, like all the transgressive punk rock energy was on the left, but now all the punk rock transgressive energy is on the right of like tearing shit down and stuff like that. And so I would have just gone for that. And so it's my cussedness that makes me like and disagree with Chesterton.
Well, on that note, we should probably wrap this up. That's actually a great spot to stop. I do want to ask you guys final thoughts, maybe a final pitch. If anybody's still listening who hasn't read the book, or we can give people a tool in their tool belt for recommending this book. How would you pitch this book to somebody who's never read it, or would you? These days, who would you pitch it to? How and why?
Okay, I would say read this book if you enjoy a poppy, pulpy adventure story, but you want to close the book at the end and be left with something burning in your chest.
Durton.
That sounds great. Yeah, I would say you sell it as an adventure story. If you say, oh, you love this book, it's a philosophical fever dream, they'll say, get that out of here. I don't want to hear about that. But you say it's a crazy turn of the century adventure story with capers and bomb plots and disguises and all that, and then it just, there's aspects of it that are just visionary and uncanny. Then I think, or maybe horrifying. Then and it's funny too. It's really funny, and we didn't really get into the humor of this book, like when Gregory is trying to give that speech toning down anarchism and all that, and he was like, we don't, eat human flesh, and the anarchist's like, why not?
He said, he goes, our movement is about love, and everybody's like, screw you.
Down with love. It's funny. It's an adventure story. It's very short, and you will be changed. And it's the kind of book you will read and reread for the rest of your life. But I think it's the kind of book that you know who is going to like it when you meet the person. Like just from even I'll tell you this: any spiritually searching Catholic would love this book, for sure.
Yeah.
It is. I think it's but it is not a. I think people who just like social realism, or you know. And that's all they like, and they don't like anything weird would not like this book. And so, but I know those people. You can sniff them out within 5 minutes, and you can cross them off your list and not talk to them.
There you go.
Oh yeah, and I will add one more addendum to that. If you're recommending this book and it's to the sort of reader who will become upset by outdated social mores, not this one.
Yeah.
This is a book written around turn of the century England. There are England in 1900 sensibilities in here.
You know, that said, it is not as bad as it could be. It could be much worse.
Not at all.
I mean, actually, in terms of that, if you took like all the books that are written in 1908, I think this would be in the top 5% of not having problematic content.
Because it's like you said, you know, it's not just a book about the social setting. It's not trying to make that sort of a point. This is a philosophical book. And it's a book about exploring what your internal landscape is. Yes. And because of that, what other people look like doesn't really matter. You know, he uses some of these things as like, you know, signposts, like some of the, when the members of the council are in disguise, their disguises are foreigners. And then they take them off and they're Englishmen. But like, you know, that's not what the book is about. It's not trying to make a point that, oh, foreigners are evil. It's something very different.
Yeah, and actually, there's a heroic French guy later on, so don't worry about it.
Which for an Englishman to write in 1908. Yeah, absolutely. All right, you guys. I'll tell you my favorite thing about this episode is that I didn't have to talk all that much, which was perfect for this book because I got to learn a lot about what I just went through. And I hope other people pick it up and give it a shot. If it sounds like it would be good for you, I hope you do so. I also, like I said, hope you go to thelegendarium.com and check out all the links I mentioned at the top of the show. Check out Inking Out Loud if you haven't done so. Like I said, Drew, we have you enough that I'm pretty sure anybody who's ever listened to our show knows your show.
But a special shout out, we have also done an episode on The Man Who Was Thursday featuring Joseph Pierce, who is one of the leading Chesterton scholars today. He teaches Chesterton at the university level and has for a long time. Guy's has a fascinating life story. Like, talk about a life of contradictions. Joseph Pierce grew up in England, was a literal terrorist, wrote newspapers for the IRA.
Oh, wow.
Was imprisoned multiple times, eventually converted to Catholicism, was like, what was I doing in my misguided youth, and became a world-renowned scholar and professor.
Yeah, and that was only within the last few months. Do you happen to have the episode number on that one?
Ooh, I do have the episode number. If you give me just a moment. It was episode 158.
Okay, so yeah, people can go check that out. And James, you mentioned your books. Last time you were on, we were talking about Dare to Know. People can go check that out. It is actually, I think it's number 3 on my TBR list.
Oh,
right now. So I'm getting close, James.
Craig.
Yeah,
it's another book that, as many people online say, the last quarter is crazy. So,
all right. I'm looking forward to it.
And in the fall, Bride of the Tornado.
There you Bride of the Tornado. It's so fantastic. So everybody make sure you go check those out.
Oh, but one last thing.
Please go ahead.
The Order of Oddfish is very Man Who Is Thursday-y. The villain of that book, the Belgian prankster, is very much a takeoff on Sunday. And there's a scene which is just like the Feast of Fear scene in The Man Who Is Thursday, but it happens in a country kitchen in Muscatine, Iowa. But there's so much of the Order of Oddfish. My first book is kind of just taken so much from, like, I did what one should not do, which is try to emulate The Man Who Is Thursday and catch that lightning in a bottle again. If you like Man Who Is Thursday, you might like The Order of Oddfish.
The Order of Oddfish. All right, absolutely. Cool. Well, James, thank you so much for coming on again. Really appreciate it. And this is a conversation that's gone longer than I usually let them go because, man, what a book. What a pick, James. Well done. Thank you.
And thanks for coming along, Drew. I'm glad we have the Catholic perspective. I think it's very, very necessary for a book like this.
It's great to meet you. Great chatting about this. I had a wonderful time today.
Me too.
I was thinking about naming this episode Two Catholics and a Mormon. Just maybe that'll draw people in and get them to listen.
With the Mormon, you can't have it be two Catholics and a Mormon walk into a bar.
Well, you can now.
Okay. I was gonna say.
Depends on how lapsed that Mormon is.
Craig, have you read The Accidental Terrorist by William Shun?
No.
It's really good. I missed a whole other conversation.
That was a really great hesitation there.
It's something that it's written by ex-Mormon who about his time as doing the missionary work, and basically the just in his life, what he did is that he tried to get out of, he was lost the faith, he tried to get out of it. His friend, they brought him back into it, so they're both there, and they continue to do the mission, and then his senpai left, and then he got a kohai, and then he was guiding him. His kohai said, I'm going to I don't believe this anymore. I'm going to leave. He's getting on a plane. This guy, William Shun, this is a real life story. He said, I cannot let him get away. He has to come back to the mission. He called in a bomb threat to the airline to ground the plane so he could get him off it. Then he got caught, thrown into Canadian prison, which sounds hilarious, Canadian prison. But he had and then the church got him out, blah 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 blah. But he talks about his time in the missions and the day-to-day life of what it's like, which I never knew about, and then intersperses that with the history of Mormonism in America. It is a great book. I recommend it 100%. The Accidental Terrorist by William Shun.
Well, there's your recommendation right there.
Yeah.
All right. And on that note, thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure you head to Discord where we'll have a thread for this episode. You can make your thoughts known. Gentlemen, once again, thank you very much, and I will see everybody next time.
Thank you.